I want to welcome everyone to the second webinar in our series, the Summer 2020 Death Penalty Focus webinar series. Death Penalty Focus, as many of you know, is a nonprofit which is dedicated to abolishing the death penalty. This webinar series and everything that we do is to reach that goal. And we ask for donations because that's how we run this organization and build these webinars. So, and I'll just show you a little screen that I need to show you just because I do. So I will show you this at various times throughout the day. It is very easy to donate to Death Penalty Focus, and we hope that you will. And we also are interested in anyone who is interested in volunteering to help us. So, in the last webinar that we had, there were quite a few people there, and in the last webinar, we featured conservative leaders who supported abolition of the death penalty. Today, we're focusing on a different point of view, which is the point of view of prosecutors who reject the death penalty for their jurisdictions. Originally, we titled this session, "The Death Penalty, the Myth of Public Safety." But after talking with the district attorneys and reading material that they've written and speeches that they have given, it is clear that their opinions go far beyond just the issue of public safety. So we renamed this seminar, "Why Prosecutors Reject the Death Penalty." So with that, let me introduce our very esteemed guests. I would like to introduce Beth Mccann, who is the District Attorney of Denver, Colorado, the first woman district attorney, by the way. Thank you for that, Beth. And Chesa Bodine, who is the District Attorney of San Francisco. Let me tell you a little bit about Beth and a little bit about Chase, and then from there, we'll go into a conversation between the two of them. Beth Mccann is the district attorney for Denver. She was elected November 2016, sworn in January. As I said, she is the first female district attorney in Denver County. She began with a law degree from Georgetown. Following law school, she was a clerk at the U.S. District Court in Denver. She left the court and became a deputy district attorney, so she's definitely familiar with the office. She worked in private practice for 8 years. She's had a life of public service. She worked for Mayor Wellington Webb in the 90s, and she became the first director of the Denver Safe City program, which is a program that strives to give children alternatives to drugs, gangs, and violence. And thank you for that, too. Beth served as under the Attorney General. She had 33 lawyers working for her at a time. Immediately prior to becoming district attorney, Beth served 4 terms in the legislature as a representative of Central and North Central Denver. As far as Beth, her position about the death penalty is unambiguous. In her campaign for district attorney, it was clear to everyone that her position was the following: I don't think that the state should be in the business of killing people. So thank you for that, Beth. I want to thank you. We're looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, Chase Bodine comes from a storied lefty political family. His grandfather, Leonard Bodine, was a famous civil rights attorney. He argued frequently in the U.S. Supreme Court, and so his grandson certainly steps into big shoes. His parents belonged to the SDS and Weather Underground and were sentenced to prison when he was very young. So the criminal justice system is deep in his bones. Chase attended Yale Law. After law school, he worked for federal judges. He came to work at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office in 2012. He's handled hundreds of felony cases. Chase has fought for criminal justice reform through his career. He helped launch the Public Defender's first immigration unit, work with the Sheriff's Department for fair treatment of immigrants. In taking office, District Attorney Bodine took an absolute stand against the death penalty. In his own words, An increasing number of Americans have come to recognize that the death penalty is not only undeniably cruel and inconsistent with the values of humane society, but also fails to deter or prevent crime. The district attorney says, my office has not sought and will not seek the death penalty. And most recently, Chesa's office has dismissed or has taken away the death penalty from the only prisoner in San Quentin on death row and had him resentenced to a term of 47 to life. And so someday he may see the free world. So thank you for that also, Chase. So to begin with, I'd like to ask you both, and I thought we can go back and forth, but I'd like to ask you both your experience with the death penalty. And both of you have esteemed legal careers. And can you tell us about your experience with the death penalty? And what were occasions in your life that caused your sense about the death penalty either to strengthen or to change? So shall we start with you, Beth?
Sure. So when I was a deputy DA in Denver, I made a conscious decision that I would not handle a death penalty case if requested, and I never did. So there was a case while I was in the DA's office that was a death penalty case, and I remember realizing how impactful a death penalty case is on the entire office, and how it really kind of drains resources because everybody is concerned about it and anxious about it. And as is appropriate, defense attorneys file hundreds of motions when there is a life on the line. So I did experience the fact that it really does cause a lot of anxiety in the entire office, really, when there is a case of that magnitude that's pending. In terms of my opinion, I mean, I guess I've held that opinion for a long time because I did not want to be involved in a death penalty case when I was in the trenches. So I think it comes from kind of a moral grounding that, we make it a crime to take another person's life. And so to have the state in the role of taking someone's life, in my opinion, is wrong. And part of it is just a deep-seated feeling that that taking another person's life is wrong, even in the context of a conviction of murder and a punishment context. And I think, we'll be talking later about some of the other reasons, but I have never felt that it served as a deterrence for heinous crimes, because we continue to have heinous crimes. Throughout the country, in places where there is the death penalty. And when the death penalty was alive and well in Colorado, we certainly had horrible crimes. We have had our share of, as you know, mass shootings. And when the Aurora Theater shooter was not sentenced to death by a jury, it reaffirmed that people in Colorado are not really supportive of the death penalty. And if you look at a case like the Aurora Theater shooting, when the death penalty was still an available option, it didn't stop him. And I don't think it serves as a deterrent. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Beth. I know that Colorado, from being a Coloradan, I know that Colorado people are definitely on the fence about the whole thing and not necessarily supportive. So, and Chesa?
Well, thank you, Nancy. It's great to be with you, and it's great to hear about Beth's career and her courage in the face of some of the pressures that she faced. I'll tell you, I remember visiting jails and prisons as some of my earliest memories, because as you said, Nancy, my parents were arrested when I was just 14 months old. My father's still incarcerated today, and it's been something that has had a profound impact, as you can imagine, on my entire life. It's something that continues to affect me and my family. And so the realities of what it means to spend life in prison are not ever and never could be lost on me. But it's also a stark contrast to the death penalty. And I remember thinking about how, as a child, how if my parents had been prosecuted in a different state, or even in the same state under a slightly different legal regime that existed in a different time period, it's possible the state would have sought the death penalty against my parents. And I remember doing research when I was in middle school for history classes, looking at even though I was a long way away from being a lawyer, looking at the legal history of the death penalty in the United States and how and why it would seem appropriate to administer the death penalty, to have the state engaged in taking human life, particularly given the overwhelming evidence that, as Beth said, it fails to serve as a deterrent, and the overwhelming evidence that its administration is rife with error, including innocent people being wrongfully convicted and then sentenced to death, and including horrific racial bias in who receives the death penalty, particularly racial bias with regard to the victims of crime. We know that white crime victims are far more likely to have a death penalty imposed than victims of color. And when I ran for district attorney last year, I ran with a background as a public defender. I ran in a context where most of my legal career had been spent in San Francisco superior courts. And luckily for me and for San Francisco, none of my predecessors in recent memory in the office of district attorney had sought the death penalty. And you can go back about 25 years before you find a San Francisco case where the district attorney sought the death penalty. And what's important about that is two different things I want to emphasize briefly right now. First is, it meant that when I ran for district attorney, the death penalty was not a controversial election issue. None of the other candidates, none of them said that they would seek the death penalty if elected. Some of them hedged a little bit and suggested they'd be open to it under certain circumstances, but none of them campaigned with the idea that they would seek the death penalty. And so it was a politically safe position to take, one that is consistent with my entire life, and thankfully with the values and principles of the electorate that I represent. But the second reason why the nearly 25 years of no death penalty cases in San Francisco is so relevant and so important is because if you look at what's happened with violent crime, including the kinds of cases that would be death penalty eligible over the last 25 years in San Francisco, since we stopped seeking the death penalty, you see a steady and significant decrease in violent crime. We know empirically, and we know just from human nature, that people who commit serious crimes don't do so thinking that they're going to get caught or doing the calculation about what the likely punishment is. They simply don't operate that way. I know that my parents didn't think they were going to get caught in the crime they committed. And so those sorts of draconian, high risk, and no margin for error types of punishments simply have no useful role, and they're immoral. So I'm proud to be a loud voice opposing the death penalty in San Francisco and beyond. And I look forward to working with you, Nancy, and with you, Beth, and with everyone else who understands how immoral, how unethical, and how high risk it is for the state to tinker with the machinery of death.
Thank you so much for that. Beth, let me ask you, when you were running for office to be district attorney of Denver, how did your political opponents address your view on the death penalty?
So like Chesa, it really wasn't much of an issue in the campaign. My primary opponent, so I had a very tough primary among the Democratic voters, and one of my opponents was very clear that he did not support the death penalty. The other one was in the office, and so he did not take a position opposing the death penalty. But it was, I think the voters of Denver, probably similar to San Francisco, don't support the death penalty. And so it was not really an issue to speak of. And again, and also in Denver, there was a death penalty case about 5 years ago with my predecessor. And it was a horrible, brutal, just terrible case where 5 people were stabbed to death in a bar in a very brutal and senseless way. And then the bar was set on fire. And my predecessor sought the death penalty and was not successful in convincing a Denver jury to impose it. So I think that, and in Colorado, really, it's been since 1967 since we've had someone actually executed. We did have 3 men on death row up until last year when the legislature abolished the death penalty in Colorado. The governor signed that bill and commuted the sentences of the 3 people that were on death row. So we had people on death row, but it really had been used very sparingly in Colorado as a whole, and certainly in Denver, we have not had someone sentenced to death since I think 1967. So I think that I have to say there are still in Colorado, however, the state, there are many people who support the death penalty. And I think the polling right before the vote was taken in the legislature would have shown a majority of people supported the death penalty in Colorado. So had I been running in another, jurisdiction in Colorado, it might have been a different issue in terms of the campaign itself. But for Denver, it was something that I think the Denver voters wanted to hear.
Thank you for that. I did read your testimony before the Colorado Senate, where you talk about the issue of death penalty repeal being an issue not for the public. This is an interesting conversation to have because in California, the way that we have to repeal the death penalty is through a ballot initiative. Mm-hmm. So it has to go to the citizens of the state. Can you, Beth, speak to your opinions about that?
Yes. So that was probably the biggest opposition to the bill in the legislature last year, and actually the year before as well, was that this should go to a vote of the people. It's very easy to get things on the ballot in Colorado. We do petitions. It's gotten a little bit harder because of some legislation, but for a constitutional amendment, it is easy. It's relatively easy to get something on the ballot. So that was the big issue, was this should go to a vote of the people. So my position is and was that this issue is not really an appropriate issue for a popular vote. First of all, it involves really constitutional and legal issues that are complex and that get kind of lost in the politicizing of a referendum or an initiative. And I think we've seen in Colorado when issues are on the ballot that they become very political, and it becomes, in many cases, whichever side has the most money and can put, money into ads, either for or against an initiative. So in that context, I think that the nature of the death penalty discussion is so serious and it's so emotional that it really needed to be done in a thoughtful and controlled environment versus, flyers arriving at your doorstep with some horrible picture of a horrible murder. And, I think that having it done in the legislature allowed for a much more thoughtful discussion. So, and of course the public can come and speak in committees in the legislature. So the public was certainly welcome to either show up in person and testify, because we have open testimony on bills, and also contact their legislators. So they can write, they can send emails, they can go and visit a legislator. So the public certainly had input, and appropriately so, to the decision. But I also think the legislature is in a better position to evaluate the costs of the death penalty prosecutions on the budget, and to really engage in a thorough and thoughtful discussion of the issues versus having it be a political campaign.
Thank you. Chase, let me ask you, I mean, you're a district attorney. District attorneys across the state are largely in favor of the death penalty. How is it that we can best influence district attorneys to rethink the death penalty? And you're in a very liberal community. How do we address people in Bakersfield? How do we address people in Fresno about the ills of the death penalty?
Well, I think, Nancy, as Beth said, these are complicated issues, and they're issues that in many ways, the legislature has a unique perspective and ability to address. But as you pointed out, in California, it's not up to the legislature. And so we do need to stop sending people to death row, and that's at the district attorney level. We could solve the problem, as you said, through a referendum or ballot initiative. We could have a governor, as we do today, who's unwilling to sign execution warrants. Those are important steps, but we also need, as your question points out, elected district attorneys like myself to simply stop sending more people to death row. And I think there's a couple ways we do it. I think one is to look at what should be a top priority for all district attorneys, which is what's good public policy to further public safety. And the death penalty is not that. We have tremendous amounts of data showing it does not decrease crime and that it is massively expensive. The litigation, the number of years it takes, the cost of execution, all of it is a drain on resources that could be better spent on other areas of law enforcement and public safety agendas. So I think one thing for many folks, especially for more conservative voters who elect district attorneys in the kind of counties that you mentioned, is to make the public safety argument using data and to make the economic argument, again, using data, and show what the fiscal cost is and why it's actually cheaper, far cheaper, to give someone a life without parole sentence, for example, than it is to give them the death penalty. And in those cases, if there is a wrongful conviction, then we have the chance to go back and undo it. I grew up in Chicago. I remember being at Northwestern Law School when then Northwestern professor, now Stanford professor Larry Marshall, organized a press conference with then governor of Illinois, who was a Republican, to declare a moratorium on the death penalty. And it took more than a dozen people on Illinois' death row being fully exonerated of the crimes they had been convicted of to change that policy. Those human stories, together with the data showing the really ineffective role the death penalty has played in any public safety measure and in the dollars and cents approach, I think are the most powerful ways to reach voters that aren't persuaded, as I know the three of us are, by the moral and ethical concerns.
Thank you for that. I just must ask all of our viewers if you would send your questions through the Q&A, and later on in this webinar, we'll get to those questions. So I'd like to ask you though, Chase, if there will be, at some point in the not too distant future, another ballot initiative to abolish the death penalty. And I wanted to know, will you endorse that?
I don't know the answer to that, Nancy, but if there is one, I will certainly endorse it and support it. I look forward to working with all of our allies to end the death penalty. I think it's an abomination. I think it's a disgrace. And I think it's a trademark really of a bygone era when we were less civilized than we like to think of ourselves being today. And there's really no role in modern civilized society where we have the ability, if it's actually necessary, to give someone a life without parole sentence. There is no justification for the state engaging in the taking of human life. There's just no justification for it. And I look forward to doing anything and everything I can to help California end the death penalty. It's one of the reasons I was so excited, as you mentioned in your introduction of me, that we had an opportunity to resentence the last person on death row out of San Francisco County. I'm so happy to say that not only does San Francisco no longer seek the death penalty, but we also no longer have anyone on California's death row.
Thank you for that, truly. Let me ask you both the question. One of the things that we hear commonly in discussing the death penalty is the concept that the death penalty is necessary to give families and victims' families closure. And I mean, Beth, how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I don't like that word closure, because if you've lost a loved one through a horrible murder or a horrible sex assault, I don't think there really is closure. So I try not to use that term. I try to use more some resolution or some relief. And in my opinion, that comes about more quickly and in a more certain fashion through either a trial and then a finding of guilt and a sentence, or a plea bargain and a sentence, so that there is a definite procedure and a definite end to the criminal procedure, versus the typical death penalty case, which may take 20 to 30 years to resolve. By the time appeals continue, new evidence may be found. In the case, one of the cases in that the person was on death row in Colorado, that case was at least 30 years old and had been through a number of appeals, a number of considerations. And then the other two guys, there was just recently a question about whether a juror was objective. They found out some more information about a juror, and it just brought the whole thing back up again. And I think, the defense attorneys and the appellate attorneys will continue to fight these cases with everything they've got. And I think that's excruciating, can be excruciating on a victim's family. It just goes on and on and on, versus, okay, the guy's sentenced to life in prison and, we're done. Not to say that there won't be appeals, but it's, to me, it seems quicker and actually a little less disruptive to a victim's family. But again, I don't know that there's never closure as such, but I think the case, it goes quicker with less anxiety, less trauma for the family if it's done without the potential of the death penalty. And, there are a number of victims' families, even in the Aurora Theater shooting, where 12 people were killed, 70 were injured. There were a number of the families who did not support the seeking of the death penalty in that case. So, victims' families are not in agreement on whether or not death penalty would be appropriate.
Thank you. And Chesa, what do you think about the closure?
I want to echo much of what Beth said about closure. I think that we use that word a lot, and it's something that many of us seek in different areas of life, whether it's experiences with crime or other difficult emotional circumstances, loss of a loved one. And the reality is it's often evasive. It's a term we use, but it is a concept that is really evasive. And I want to just go back for a moment to the example that I used in my last answer about San Francisco's last person who had been on death row, Clifford Bolden. That crime, it's a horrific crime, was committed in 1986. The reason that we were in a position to resentence Mr. Bolden a few months ago was because he was still in the midst of ongoing litigation over his case. It was in a federal habeas posture, and it was still probably years away from a final Supreme Court denial, if in fact that's what had happened. And so we resolved the litigation by giving Mr. Bolden a different sentence, and he waived and withdrew his other claims. But if the family were looking for closure, the trial and the sentence back after the 1986 killing would not have provided that, because 34 years later, there's still active litigation. And there was still the prospect of potentially a reversal and a retrial. You don't have that kind of dragged out, never-ending litigation process in non-death penalty cases. You have a much faster, simpler appellate review. And then to the extent there's going to be closure, and to the extent closure is going to be found from something that we do in the criminal justice system. And I don't necessarily think that's the case for most crime victims, but to the extent it is for some, you're not going to get it from death penalty litigation. You're much more likely to get it from non-death penalty litigation. And I'll just say one more piece about, the difficulties and the challenges of ongoing litigation for families. It's not just that you don't know the final outcome. It's also that you may be called back in to testify, or you may have new court proceedings that you want to attend. And each of those rounds of litigation, each of those hearings could potentially be ripping off old wounds. And so if you're looking for closure, a simpler, more streamlined process that doesn't involve the possibility of the death penalty is actually a faster, more efficient way to go. And to the extent there's any risk of a person being wrongfully convicted, there's a number of high-profile cases where people have been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. And the impact that has on crime victims when they find out that someone was wrongfully executed because of what happened to them and because of errors in policing or prosecution, it's devastating. And so we're actually exposing crime victims to a real risk of imposing more trauma in multiple different ways when we tinker with the death penalty. So I think, there's lots of ways we can support victims. Frankly, I think it's disgraceful how little our government is willing to invest in victim services and victim support. So much punishment, so many draconian mandatory minimums and death penalty statutes have been justified in the name of those victims who call for retribution and vengeance. But victims who call for mercy or clemency are often ignored and written out of the conversation. And even those victims who call for vengeance are left to fend for themselves when it comes to medical bills and therapy and rebuilding their lives in the wake of horrific tragedy that's destroyed their family and their sense of normalcy. We as a society need to start putting our money where our mouth is. Instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on death penalty litigation, we should invest that money in actually supporting crime victims and helping them to heal. That's how we'll move forward and find true closure.
Thank you. You raised some very interesting points, and one is the point of innocence. I think that we see with 168 people who have been exonerated, who were on death row, those are a potential 168 lives that could be lost for crimes they didn't commit. And we see this at the highest level of the death penalty. I'd just like to ask, since you don't have the death penalty in either of your jurisdictions, what guidance would you give to other district attorneys and to in your office that will improve you can't eliminate the discrimination in charging or the discrimination in sentencing, but to improve the sake of justice in your offices? What will you impose, or what can you suggest? Beth?
Well, that's a pretty broad question. When I was elected, one of the things that I was very concerned about was the disproportionate impact on people of color in the criminal justice systems. So I purchased the book, The New Jim Crow, for every member of my office. And then we had discussion groups about that book. And it is a tough topic to talk about, which, we're seeing now with the protests and demonstrations, very much focus on race and the criminal justice system. So we've been talking about it in my office for a while. This may not be exactly what you were asking, but I think that it's something that we as prosecutors need to be very cognizant of, and we need to, as someone said the other day, keep our antenna up. So when we're looking at cases, looking at, is there a racial component here, an inappropriate racial component, and being willing to speak up and speak out. So we're forming a committee now in my office that will be, that people in the office can refer cases to where they have a question, for example, about a stop, and was the stop perhaps race-based. And so I'm hoping that we will be able to have dialogue with the police department. I think we will. We have a good relationship with our police department here, about things that we see when we're evaluating cases that raise our antenna. So that's something that I'm hoping we will be able to do effectively. In terms of sentencing, I think, another thing that we did is I had a committee to make recommendations about the use of the habitual criminal statute, which is the 3 strikes and you're out law that we have here. I think most states have something along those lines. And that's an area that I think has some area that we could do a better job of really looking at cases. I mean, like Chesa, I've been able to go back through some cases where I've seen really out of line sentences for nonviolent felonies because the person had 3 or 4 forgeries, felony forgeries, or drug felony convictions, and now they're in prison for 80 or 90 years. I think that's an area that's really ripe for analysis and discussion, and when do we use those kinds of draconian sentencing laws. Sometimes it is appropriate, when you have someone who continues to commit violent crime and has been given opportunities to change behavior. Clearly, we need to have a mechanism to keep those people out of the community because of safety. But I think that's an area that our legislature is going to be looking at, I think, is mandatory minimum sentences and the whole sentencing scheme. And these are hard, tough decisions, and we make recommendations to the judges. And I think one thing that people are not talking about quite as much is educating the judges as well and helping them understand what goes on with families that come from poverty and drug addiction and so forth. And so it's a whole system-wide effort that's pretty comprehensive and also a little overwhelming because these are big systems that have been in place for many years. And it's easier to put someone in prison than it is to get them off drugs, or I don't know that that's, I guess that is the case. I mean, trying to really deal with someone who is drug addicted and just cannot get off the drugs, it's easier to say, okay, you go serve 2 years in prison and then you get out. So I would like to see us have a very comprehensive look at criminal justice. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling, so.
That's okay. Just one last question before we go to questions from the viewers. Chesa, I've noticed recently that and along these same lines of discrimination and unfair treatment, I've noticed recent articles about the fact that 40% of the people who were incarcerated in San Francisco jails were minorities or were Black, and the percentage of people who are Black in San Francisco County is 5%. I mean, how can you address that?
It is right, Nancy. The statistics are really shocking and distressing. When I took office in January, approximately 50% of our jail was Black. And as you say, around 5% of the city is Black. Now, there's a couple of things going on there. But, we could look at demographics in the broader Bay Area. We could look at other issues in terms of who's being arrested in San Francisco. Not always San Francisco residents. But the real issue that your question points to is the really horrific racial disparities that we see at basically every step of the criminal justice process, from traffic stops to searches to arrests to charges to bail to prosecution to sentencing to parole. At every step of the process throughout this country, there are racial disparities. And there are racial disparities that serve to really punish Black and brown communities. And we've got to find ways to change it. I'll give you a couple concrete examples of policies I put in place over the last few months to begin to change the racial disparities. And as Beth said, these are big topics. They're broad topics. They're not things that any one of us can change on our own just with a snap of a finger. They're going to take time. They're going to take changing norms and culture in our offices and in our courts, as well as in our legislatures. But I'll give you a couple examples. In San Francisco, we know that Black and brown drivers are far more likely to be stopped for any number of thousands of different technically legal traffic stop justifications. Broken taillight, failing to come to a complete stop at a stop sign, not using a turn signal, what have you. And we know that those stops are basically pretextual stops, the sort of stop and frisk style policing that we saw in New York City to so much controversy, where hundreds of thousands of young Black and brown men were stopped and searched as part of an official policy. We've seen basically the same thing in San Francisco over the last 20 years. Numerous reports have documented the racial bias, the civil rights violations, and the ways in which this style of policing actually undermines public safety by eroding trust in communities that do suffer from crime. Well, we put in place a policy back in February to ensure that we are no longer complicit in that sort of systematic, system-wide civil rights violation or discrimination. And the policy is a simple one. The policy presumes that my office will never charge contraband cases that stem from pretextual traffic stops. We cannot begin to change police behavior if we continue to prosecute cases that arise from their misconduct. If we do, then we're simply rewarding them and encouraging them to keep doing the same thing. I'll give you another example. California's sentencing is dominated by what we call status enhancements. People with prior convictions are given sometimes double, triple, or more the maximum punishment for a new offense because of prior convictions or because of their identity in a group, such as a alleged criminal street gang. Those sorts of status enhancements that punish people for who they are or what they've already been punished for in the distant past, rather than focusing on holding them accountable for the conduct in the case at hand, are a legacy of the 1990s tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key mentality that we know led to mass incarceration and did not help make our communities safer. We also know the exacerbated racial disparities because about 40% of people in California's prisons serving 3 strikes life sentences are Black, about 40%. So what we did back in February was we implemented a simple policy that presumes we will only prosecute people and hold them accountable for what they've done in this case. We will not seek to double or triple or add years and years to their sentence based on who they are or what they were previously punished for in the past. Those sorts of simple, common sense policies help us address and mitigate the horrific racial disparities that we see at every step of the criminal justice system.
Thank you. You know, that your statements really embody a lot of the goals of progressive prosecution. When you were talking about this just now, you mentioned, the war on crime from the 90s. One of the things that we still see in district attorney races is this idea of being tough on crime. And Tough on Crime is a slogan that brings to district attorney races endorsements from the sheriff's union, the correction officers union, the district attorneys union, and so forth. I'm wondering to the extent, do you believe that that elections for district attorneys are a suboptimal way to choose the head law enforcement person in a community?
That's an interesting question. I am a big believer in the electorate and in elections because I think a couple reasons. One, it forces the person who is running to be out in the community and listening to people and talking to people and walking door to door and making phone calls and going to neighborhood meetings. So I think that's really important. It's very easy as a prosecutor to sit up in your office and, deal with your cases in the courtroom, but never really talk with the community. And I think in Denver, that's been a problem in the past. It was a very insular office and was not out in the community very much. And so I think that's an important piece of being elected. The police union here did not support me. They supported my opponent. I don't think the police union endorsement was, I didn't even want their endorsement. When you're running on kind of a progressive platform, in Denver anyway, I don't think that helped to get their endorsement. I think you can be independent from that. And we don't have a really strong union. Like I know back east in particular, some of my colleagues have really been slammed by police unions or sheriff unions. We don't see that so much here. They tend to go more after their police chief or their sheriff. But I don't think we can be afraid of elections. The downside to elections is the money and having to raise money. And I think that's unfortunate. I would like to see public support of financial support for campaigns, so you don't spend so much of your time trying to raise money. We have limits on contributions that are very low in Colorado, so I can only get $400 per person in the race, and that's true of all of the district attorneys throughout the state. And we also have term limits, so that changes things as well. So DAs are in office for a shorter period of time. It's 8 years for most. Denver voted to extend theirs to 12 years, but so there's an opportunity for new ideas and new thoughts to come into play in our DA races. So I guess I would not like to see it be an appointed position. I also think our independence from the mayor or whoever would appoint us, the governor, is important. I'm an independently elected official, so nobody tells me what to do except the community. So I think that's a good thing.
And Chesa, what do you think?
I tend to agree with Beth. I think the experience of being out in the community, of shaking hands at bus stops, of doing house parties, and of going to every Democratic club to seek endorsements and hear feedback is a really critical part of what allows us to stand up in court and say that we represent the people. And if you don't do that, then you're really insulated in ways that I think can be damaging. Let me make two other brief points about it. One is, in the United States, we do have lots of prosecutors who are appointed rather than elected. There are U.S. attorneys. At the federal level, all of our prosecutors are appointed. And we can see in the way that the current administration has really politicized those appointments and been very punitive with people who seek to be independent-minded, that there are real problems with that approach as well. I think, the challenge for those of us that are elected and for those of us focusing on local prosecutor races where you do have elections is to ensure that we have an educated populace, is to ensure that we have parity in fundraising opportunities. As Beth said, that's a huge disadvantage that most progressive candidates have when it comes to electoral politics. And so there are lots of problems with how, with the ways in which police unions, as was mentioned, influence the outcome of these races. In my race, the San Francisco Police Officers Association spent in the neighborhood of $750,000 just attacking me, not even endorsing one of the other candidates. So, there's a tremendous disproportionate influence that certain groups have because of the ways they're allowed to spend money freely on these races. But that doesn't mean we should do away with elections. It means we should make sure that the rules of the elections and that the access to fundraising are equitable. San Francisco has, for our Board of Supervisors, for example, and for our mayor, for example, but not for our district attorneys, a public finance option where candidates who agree to abide by certain fundraising rules will get the benefit of significant public financing. And that really levels the playing field in a way that's important for democracy.
That is really important. One of the things that comes up often when we talk about district attorneys, and as I watch the district attorney races through the state, is the fact that district attorneys do have a unique relationship with law enforcement and a unique relationship with corrections. And if they are among the most vocal and powerful financially persuaders in an election, how is it that we get an opportunity to work with them and change their opinions?
Well, I think that we work, we work individually with police officers all the time in cases. And I think building those relationships is important. After I got elected, I did meet with the police union. We talked through with their board and we talked through some of the issues. I think if we treat them fairly, when we're evaluating whether or not to file cases against police officers, I think if they feel that they're treated fairly, and in the cases that I've brought against police officers, I think that most of the police, well, I can't say that, but certainly a lot of police officers agreed that these officers were out of line and should be prosecuted. So at least in Denver, I think if we can maintain, a respect and a fairness kind of basis, that goes a long way. It's a challenging relationship because we do rely on the police for our ability to file cases and to investigate cases. But we also have the responsibility of prosecuting police officers. So, it's a tenuous relationship, but I think the more we can hear and listen to each other and provide respect, that we kind of work through it that way.
And Chesa, do you have an opinion?
I totally agree with everything that Beth has said on that issue. It is a mutually interdependent relationship. Police have the power to arrest and to investigate crimes. And if they're not making arrests and they're not investigating crimes well, then we can't successfully prosecute any case. At the same time, we often disagree. We're the ones that have to choose what charges to file, what convictions to seek, what sentences to ask for. And many times the police who made an arrest will see it differently. They'll think a different sentence should be imposed or a more serious charge should have been filed, even in those cases where we are working closely with them. And the same way that we can't satisfy the requests of every single crime victim, we also can't satisfy the request of every single arresting officer. And there are real challenges to litigation and resource discrepancies, as well as the broader interests of justice that we're elected to pursue and that we're trusted and that we've sworn an oath to uphold. The police are not elected. They don't engage with the communities the same way that elected district attorneys have to. Many of the police in San Francisco, for example, don't even live in the city. And so their interaction with people is really limited to situations where they're responding to a crime or to a call for support. And it's a different perspective than people who live here and pay taxes here and send their kids to school here. And the area that's most prone to tension, of course, as Beth said, is when we're investigating police criminal conduct. And I think, again, as Beth said, you know, most police officers, or many at least, are demoralized by criminal conduct amongst their ranks. They don't want to see impunity. They don't want to see people around them stealing money or being involved in corruption or perjury. But the unions historically have played a really, really detrimental role because they defend even criminal conduct by their members in a way that flies in the face of what they're supposed to be doing, their very purpose as law enforcement. And so when they help cover up, as has happened in San Francisco, massive racist text message scandals, or when they help cover up perjury and blatant acts of dishonesty amongst their members, it actually makes it harder for us to prosecute. It makes it harder for the public to trust and support the police, which we need. And it also creates a lot more tension between our office and the police departments because they demonize us for trying to enforce the law equally. And that's something that I promised voters I was going to do, and I'm going to do it, no matter how hard it is and no matter how much pushback there is from fear-mongering police unions. We will enforce the law equally, even if the people who commit the crimes are wearing a uniform and carrying a gun.
Thank you. Let me ask you, do either of you have a sense of a general trend nationally with respect to prosecutors and the death penalty?
I think there is a trend among bigger city prosecutors and progressive prosecutors, if you will. Certainly there is. The rural areas, the smaller jurisdictions, I don't think so, but I don't really know. I think the bigger city prosecutors definitely are not bringing death penalty cases and are supportive of repeal of the death penalty laws.
It's really surprising that that you say that, in the sense that for the smaller counties, the financial effects of the death penalty on those budgets must be just disproportional. So,
yeah, they don't have many death penalty cases, frankly.
Right.
I think where you see it more is in larger jurisdictions, but I think it's the tough on crime mentality, at least in Colorado, that you get in the more rural areas that would, the district attorneys there feel that they could not be reelected if they came out on a platform against the death penalty.
Do you have any sense, Chesa, of the of trends as far as thoughts of the death penalty go?
Well, I know that in California, for example, the death penalty is less and less popular every year. It's been a trend now for about 25 years that there's less popularity for it statewide. And we do see less people getting sent to death row. One of the problems, just to pivot back to something Beth was saying, one of the problems with the issues around cost is that, so we know, for example, in California that we save about $90,000 a year simply by reducing a death sentence to a life sentence. There's tremendous savings. What we just did in the case I mentioned, the last San Francisco person on death row, but none of those savings come to me or my office. None of them come to San Francisco. Those savings and those costs are externalities to the local district attorney. So if you choose to seek the death penalty, the cost of those decades of litigation is not borne by your office or by your jurisdiction or by your voters. It's borne by the state as a whole. And so there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of the financial incentives. And that's an important thing to remember, not just with the death penalty, but really with any sentencing reform, because the costs of incarceration are primarily borne by the state rather than by the local counties. But in terms of the shift, I mean, I think there is more education and more awareness, and there's polling data that shows that in California, there really is a trend of voters, even moderate and conservative voters, to prefer life sentences over the death penalty.
It is interesting that both Colorado and California, in Colorado, there was the unitary appeal process, which very much mirrors California's Prop 66. The idea in both of those was to speed up the appeal process for the death penalty. And I think it's notable that cases under both Prop 66 and this unitary appeal process in Colorado have not advanced at all. You know, they're all still in litigation. So I think, to me, that suggests that perhaps an initiative is not the right way to make criminal justice law. So I have viewers who are interested in your opinions about the death penalty relative to the upcoming and current financial crisis. I mean, can you speak to how, for Beth, for example, in Colorado, how does the overall death penalty there, you know, how would that have affected it had not there been the repeal?
Well, as Chesa mentioned, the state bears quite a bit of the cost of death penalty prosecution. In Colorado, the public defender's office is paid by the state, and the DAs are paid by the local counties. So the costs of the defense typically are borne by the state, which are considerable costs. And as well, the costs of the appeal process typically is handled through the Attorney General's office, which is also a state agency. So again, costs are borne by the state. The actual prosecution is borne by the counties, and the expert witnesses that are called in and so forth is all county related. But I think by eliminating the death penalty, we are saving both the counties and the states quite a bit of funding. I don't have the figures. The public defender's office in our jurisdiction is not required to publicize the costs of their representation of people. So we don't have costs of the public defender's costs for representing death penalty defendants. But I know that it saves a tremendous cost not to have that kind of prosecution going on, and then not to have the endless appeals that the Attorney General's office has to handle. So I think it's helping with the financial crisis because we have a little bit more money. Honestly, in Colorado, as I said, there have been so few death penalty cases brought in the last 25, 30 years. I don't know that it has a significant impact, but it certainly has an impact on the budgets.
Yeah, you know, I'll just echo that. I mean, I think I mentioned a moment ago that converting a death penalty sentence to a life without parole sentence in California saves about $90,000 a year. And that doesn't even speak to the cost of the trial and the ultimate execution if it happens. But the death penalty is a tremendously expensive process. And it's one that's not necessary. It's one that we know serves no real public purpose and furthers no legitimate public aims. And so California, about a month ago, had a $54 billion, with a B, $54 billion deficit. In a context where we have deficits that big, do we really need to spend the extra $90,000 a year for every one of the people on death row? Absolutely not. It's an obvious place where we can save significant amounts of money and do so in a way that actually is consistent with our values and principles as a civilized society. So I think that when we see a budget crisis, it's actually an opportunity to take a close look at where we're spending our money and question, does it align with our values and does it further our goals? And is this the best use? If we care about public safety, if we care about victims' rights, is spending that extra $90,000 per year, that extra amount just to convert a life without parole into a death penalty sentence, is that a good, effective, efficient use of that money? I think it's obvious the answer is no.
Thank you both so much. And I think Nancy may have
Thank
been.
you.
Oh,
Thank you.
she's
I'm back.
Thank goodness. Okay.
Sorry about
I was
that.
about to jump in.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. I think we're pretty much out of time. I wanted to thank you both so much and ask you for your advice about our directions moving forward to abolish the death penalty. So shall I start with you, Chesa?
Yeah, why don't you start with
Sure.
you?
I wish I had easy answers, but I think it really is one of those fights that it's a righteous fight. It's a important fight, and it's one that can't be a single fight. We have to wage it in every jurisdiction across the country. We have to persuade those elected prosecutors who are already not seeking the death penalty to feel comfortable announcing that they will never seek the death penalty. We have to persuade those elected prosecutors who still sometimes seek the death penalty that they should stop seeking the death penalty. And when it comes to governors, we have to persuade them to stop signing death warrants and to halt executions in their state. I think at every one of those levels, we have to continue to have this fight. And it's a fight that requires persuading everyday voters that it's the wrong thing to do, that it doesn't promote safety, that it doesn't help victims heal, that it's a waste of resources, and that it's inhumane, immoral, unethical, and unsafe to engage in state-sanctioned killing. I think as we persuade individual people, as we persuade individual elected officials to take that one extra step, we're winning the battles that lead us to win this war.
Beth?
Well said, Chesa. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that, one of the things that struck me was I ran very publicly on a no death penalty platform. And so if this were actually a deterrent, one would have expected that we would have seen a number of very horrific, brutal murders in Denver after I got elected. We didn't. So I think that argument is just easily put to bed. I think that we as a country, our criminal justice system has been really punitive, oriented toward a punitive system. And there is definitely room for a punitive part of criminal justice, the criminal justice system. There are people who need to be punished and kept away from our communities. But I'm hopeful that people will also begin to see that there are other options that may be more effective in preventing recidivism, reducing crime. If we can put more resources in the front end, as Chesa was talking about, as opposed to more resources toward our prisons and our, potential execution of people, putting more resources into education and job opportunities and helping combat poverty, then that to me is a more effective way to reduce crime than the constant emphasis just on the punitive end of it, because it's not working. I mean, we are, unfortunately, in Denver, we have had a pretty recent uptick in violent crime, and we need to really be thinking about better ways to address crime and thinking about mental health and substance abuse and how do we deal with those in a more effective way. And I know I'm varying off the topic a little bit, but I do think talking about these things, educating people, and as Chesa mentioned, getting out in the community and discussing these things so people begin to understand that the death penalty is, it's expensive, it has the potential to be so discriminatory, because if, my colleague down in Arapahoe County chooses to bring the death penalty and I don't, it's applied so with such random effects, that's another reason that we shouldn't be looking at the death penalty. It has a lot of potential for being applied in a discriminatory manner. And it is, I mean, we're talking about taking someone's life. I mean, this is really serious business. And I understand these people have committed horrible, horrible crimes, but as a society, I think we need to be thinking about, well, Chesa uses the term civilized, or I would say enlightened, but just more conscious and thoughtful about how do we make a system that will prevent crime as well as prosecute crime. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short question.
Thank you. I thank you so much. I just so much appreciate your time. I hold you in high esteem and you have my greatest admiration. I hope we can work together sometime soon. And I hope you will support us in our move in the future to abolish the death penalty. For all of our viewers, I thank you. And once again, must remind you that we are a nonprofit organization. We live on donations. Donations bring great programs like this to you. So please, please, please contribute. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chesa. Thank you, Beth.
My pleasure.
Great to see you all.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, Chesa. Someday I'll meet you in person.